everyone, my name is Lauren Sevier and welcome to my channel. If you've ever been here before, you know that this is a totally new thing that we are doing. Normally I'm in my bedroom in Louisiana and, well, not my bedroom, but like the little writing room at the back of my house. It's like a little tiny catch-all room. And I am not in Louisiana at my house. Instead, I'm here in Vermont at the When Words Count Pitch Week event. So if you watched any of the videos that I've posted in the last few months, you know that I am part of a writing competition. And so at the end of this week, we will know who will win and leave with a traditional publishing contract. It would be really cool if I got one. But here is Micah Brown. He is actually being gracious enough to let me interview him. I badgered him into it a little bit.
She did not badger me. She asked me one time. I said, okay, that sounds fun.
Anyway, so he wrote a young adult horror novel called Designs of Death, and he is also competing for a traditional publishing contract. Because he writes in a different genre than me, I thought it would be really interesting to be able to ask him a few questions. And if you have any questions that aren't asked or answered in this video, please feel free to comment down below. And I'm sure that Micah would be more than happy to answer any of them. And I can text him and badger him into answering them.
She might have to badger me for that.
I will. Anyway, so I did want to tell you a little bit about Micah, and then I'm going to kind of throw it over to him to let him tell you a little bit more about his book. Micah is 42 years old. He has written 10 or more novels, which is so impressive to me. We're going to talk a little bit later about a famous author that he has had several, meetings and stuff with in the past as well. And generally speaking, because he's done readings of his book, he writes very, very beautifully. I can say that for sure. I will also link in the description. Micah has on Amazon self-published a short story anthology of horror stories and stuff. So if that's something you might be interested in, Catherine Francis, then, go ahead and check that out. I'll also make sure to link his social media accounts and everything, just in case you think that he's as awesome and cool as I think he is and want to connect with him. Anyway, so I'm going to bring it over here to Micah, and I'm going to let him tell you a little bit more about Designs of Death, the book that he's pitching this week for the competition.
Hello, everybody. How are you? I hope you all had a wonderful week so far, but let's get into it.
Such a goof.
We're going to make a happy little life here. So I wrote Designs of Death. It was a long process to get to this version of the book, and I'll go into that a little bit later with the whole writing aspect of this. But to give you kind of the flavor of the book, I'm going to read you the cover copy, which is what you find either on the inside flap of a hardcover or the back of a paperback.
Yeah, so basically your book blurb.
Yep. Set against the backdrop of the Colorado Rockies, Jasmine Trask is almost as tall. At 6'2", she towers over her classmates and is frequently referred to as Amazon. After a sudden tragedy strikes on the last day of 9th grade, she is thrust into a world of grief. Unknown to her, she is enveloped by supernatural forces manifested by the frequent meeting of a strange albino woman who knows her name and the names of her friends. Suffering a devastating personal loss, Jasmine's inner rage begins to boil over. Using this newfound anger to fuel a campaign against a bully who has been tormenting her friend Wesley since grade school, Jasmine enacts a complicated plan of revenge that ends in the bully's suspension. That's just the beginning. As yet another loss strikes close to home, the resulting emptiness is filled by Jasmine's fury. The resulting brutality is something that sends shockwaves through the community. Recovering from that violence, she discovers the identity of the albino woman and begins to realize there are supernatural forces guiding her toward an unknown goal. Burdened with this new information and haunted by what she's done, Jasmine tries to find her own peace of mind, even if it kills her.
So I have the unique perspective that I have actually gotten to hear some of Micah's work because he's done some readings. for the last week that we were out here, sort of mid-July. And I can honestly say that they gave me nightmares. He writes terrifyingly beautiful prose. But that's something that I'm very interested in, is the fact that I know a lot of you are aspiring authors, and I'm an aspiring author as well. So I'm going to ask Micah probably just a couple of questions along that vein, like how long have you been writing total?
Where do I begin?
I know, that's kind of how
as
I
a
feel
kid,
too.
I would write stories, meaning I would draw pictures of buses. I loved buses when I was a kid, so I would draw pictures of buses, and those would be stories, and that kind of grew into short stories here and there. The first solid short story I wrote was between 8th and 9th grade. We were assigned to write a 5-page short story, and that short story actually became the base on a very meta level of everything I wrote since then.
A very meta level. So, I guess, how long have you been writing, with the intent of publication? I think would be a better answer.
Okay, better answer.
Yeah, or a better question. Yeah.
I finished my first novel when I was 19.
Christopher Paolini wrote and published Aragon when he was 19, so color me impressed. Anyway, the next thing I wanted to ask you specifically, just because I normally write in science fiction, fantasy, dystopia, I write in a few different genres in young adult fiction, but I've never ventured it over to the horror side. So what attracted you to writing horror specifically?
I discovered horror pretty early with John Bellairs books. John Bellairs. They recently made a version of one of his books, The House with the Clock in Its Walls, with Jack Black.
I saw that.
It does not encompass the kind of horror aspect of those books, but there's a little bit of creep factor there. Those books get pretty weird and terrifying. I still think of The Curse of the Blue Figurine as the book that just used to terrify me as a kid. It would give me nightmares, and yet I'd go back and read it over and over and over.
So, why did you want to write horror, though? You could write anything in the world. What specifically about horror as a genre made you want to write those stories?
It was what I was reading a lot of. John Bellairs. I then watched the Stanley Kubrick version of The Shining. And I watched it. My friend and I snuck downstairs during an overnight, and we watched it at his house. And I thought it was a bad comedy. It didn't scare me at all. When I told my dad that I'd watched it, he was like, what do you think? And I told him that I thought it was kind of dumb. I still think it's kind of dumb. And so he took me out and he bought me the book. And I said, why would I want to read the book if the movie's so terrible? It's because the book is very different.
Yeah.
It was right. The book is very scary, very terrifying. There's just this, oppressive, claustrophobic feeling that you get in the book that's absent from the movie, along with many other things that are absent from the movie.
So you sort of fell in love with these terrifying, scary stories,
yeah.
And that's what you wanted to write.
And from starting with The Shining, I read everything that he'd written, just over and over and over and over and over. And
okay. I mean, love and passion, I think, is probably the best reason to actually write any book, honestly. And I think that's true of pretty much anyone. When you ask them, why did you sit down and spend all of these years of your life, carefully crafting this story? They're going to say, because I loved it. Otherwise, why are you doing it? This is a calling. I definitely think it's a passion. It's something you shouldn't pursue lightly. So I think it's probably the best answer you could give.
It devours your soul.
In a good way. In a positive, upbeat way.
Just ask Hemingway.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so I do want to ask if you have any advice for aspiring writers, like I would say like narrow it down to like your 3 biggest pieces of advice for anyone who is an aspiring author.
You're going to get these 3 pieces of advice from anybody. Anyone who writes, anyone who's been published, anyone who makes their money, anyone who's wanting to do this. The best advice: write every day. Finish what you're writing and write every day.
I totally understand. I don't write every day though.
One of the hardest things to do.
I don't write every day.
Is to make yourself have time to write, but finishing things is so difficult. And people don't talk about that as much in like writing guides that you might find on bookshelves. Finishing things is hard.
Yeah.
Because if any of you have a brain anything remotely like mine, you're in the middle of this book, you're 150 pages in, and you're like, oh, I just had an amazing idea. I must write it. Nope. You take a moment, you jot that idea down, and you go back to what you're working on, and you finish it. Finish it.
Yeah, finish the book.
Because otherwise you're going to have a stack of unfinished things that you're going to go back to at some point and be like, where was I with this? And if you stop in the middle, you risk losing that thread and that passion for that story, and you may never be able to go back to it.
I also think, like, if we're talking about just expanding on the advice that you just gave, if we're talking about, like, just finish the project, I think that also means, like, if there is a scene that you need to write, but it, like, skips ahead or whatever, skip ahead and write it, because once you get the first draft, that's really basically just the bones of a house. You know, you're telling the story to yourself. You can always add that scene that you didn't write in later, you know, in the revision developmental edit stage. Like, I think the most important thing is just get the story on the paper and finish the bones of the house so that you can go back and edit and revise.
Yes. So, get it out. Yeah. Get it on the paper, on the computer,
I think it's like, it's okay if you need to, like, skip ahead, or if you need to just, like, cut to black and then start at the next scene, or whatever you need to do to just move forward so you're not stuck in one place, I think, is part of that piece of advice. But I definitely agree with you. I don't write every day, though, because I'm way too busy to do that. But when I do write, I write a lot, and I try to make time for it, you know, and stuff, but life.
So my writing regimen is 1 hour a day or 1,000 words, whichever comes second. So if I hit 1,000 words and I've been writing for half an hour, I'll keep writing till that hour is up. But if I hit an hour and I still haven't gotten 1,000 words on the page, I'm going to keep writing until I do. And that keeps what you're working on, for me, this is what works for me. You'll find your own thing. But that keeps what I'm working on fresh in my mind. And so when I go back the next day to pick up, I'm not like trying to reach back 2 or 3 or a week and be like, wait, what was happening? What was I doing? Where's my brain?
Yeah, but I do that.
And that's okay. You got to do what works. I don't know how. Well, I do know how.
My crazy ADHD self.
I don't sleep. I don't recommend that.
Yeah, that's not really good advice. So let's actually move on from advice on that topic. Oh, let's not.
Ta-da.
I'm so bad. Okay, so I like this next question that I wrote down because it's a little more horror genre specific, and because I don't get a lot of content in reference, again, to the horror genre on my channel. What do you think makes a horror story, as opposed to, like, a thriller or, you know, a suspense or, you know, a gothic story? I mean, what is it that makes a story a horror story? Is it just, like, graphic depictions of violence, or what?
So I think the safe answer, I think, would be horror varies depending on who you are. So there's plenty of things out in the world that are horrific, but for me that doesn't make them a horror story. I'm very focused on a horror story being something that entails a supernatural entity, monster, ghost, poltergeist, something that is terrifyingly otherworldly.
So like the boogeyman scenario.
Yeah, the boogeyman
there's
scenario.
There's like a bad thing, and it makes scary things happen, and it drives plot and things.
If you look at, say, The Silence of the Lambs, the movie, which I prefer to the book, which is rare, Hannibal Lecter in that is a terrifying presence, but I wouldn't call Silence of the Lambs a horror movie. So there's that. I think for me, it all has
subjective.
It is all subjective, and my personal viewpoint on horror is it's got to have some kind of supernatural element. Now, it doesn't mean that any supernatural element in a book is necessarily horror. I mean, you've got wizards and magic and unicorns and fairies and sprites and all sorts of things that you can use. Fantasy, yes.
My realm. Realm of the fairies.
There needs to be more fantasy horror. Yes.
Well, there is like dark fantasy, and then there's like grim dark fantasy. So that's a thing, which I think could say you have horror elements in those novels for sure. So, so I feel like fantasy has probably 100,000 different subgenres. So there probably is one out there.
Yeah,
just saying that
certainly
fits the bill. I don't think I will write one though. I'm not quite as good as you with the whole scary stuff. So there's that. I'm a big weenie baby though.
So when you think about like breaking someone's bones in a scene, you just have to think about what celery. The whole thing is celery, and you break that, and then describe that sound.
Why are you relating horrible things to food right now? Do you hate me? I like to eat. Come on.
I don't hate you, but that's actually the sound of breaking celery is actually what they tend to use for breaking bones in movies.
Not a fan.
The more you know.
I'm not a fan. I will probably read your book just because you write very well, and because as a fellow contestant, support and all that. But I'm probably not going to sleep for a month afterwards either. So there's that. So I do have another couple of questions. So here's something, is that there is always a lot of talk in like young adult fiction about what is considered like content appropriate for young adult, because we're in this weird time where there's like new adult never really became a thing. So there's a lot of like older YA stories and stuff that could sort of be edging like adult content. And so there's a lot of controversy about that. What do you think, like I know your book has some like graphic depictions of violence and things like that in it. Do you think that that's, an appropriate young adult material? Like how would you respond to that, I guess?
Well, I read Stephen King's It when I was 15. If you want to go there.
So there's that.
There's that. And I really enjoyed it. I mean, pretty much anything that a teenager can do, experience, see, violence, sex, whatever, works. And, this book is just as much for Gen X and millennials because of the time it's based in. It's a 90s-based story.
I love the 90s
it's
music.
Squarely sitting right in the 90s, and especially coffee house culture of the 90s, which was this very kind of this weird ephemeral event that happened. Any city that you went to, you knew to go to a coffee shop and you could meet people who had a like mind. Mm-hmm. And
I love coffee.
Also, coffee is awesome.
I need coffee and an IV right now. Stat.
So as much as this is for, boys and girls who want a strong lead character, and you get that in Jasmine. Mm-hmm.
I also like that it's like a strong female character, because I think that that's, something that I think a lot of YA has is like strong female characters, but they don't have a lot of strong empowered female characters, and so I do like that.
I think it's very important. I have 2 young daughters, and when I started looking at retooling the entire novel, because it used to be very different, I thought about them, and I thought about the fact that there's so many depictions of the damsel in distress.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want there to be a damsel in distress in this movie, but I wanted it to be, or in this book,
possibly a movie later.
But I didn't want it to be. I didn't want that to be boring either, and so I thought about it, and what I have come up with, and just basing it off of my beta readers and the feedback I've gotten here so far, is it works. She is a powerful female character who is not a damsel in distress.
Yeah, I do like that. I like that a lot. So since we did talk a little bit about like advice for aspiring authors, specifically if somebody was trying to write a novel that is a horror novel, because I think the genre is just, it's very different, and you have to have, I think, a lot of knowledge in that area to make it suspenseful enough, but not a suspense. Like, you know, thrilling enough, but not a thriller, but scary enough that it could be a horror or whatever, you know, without, you know, falling into the trope trap kind of thing. So do you have any advice, like, for anyone who is specifically trying to write a horror novel? Or young adult horror, I guess.
I think for the moment, stay away from vampires and zombies.
Zombies are like a dead
We have a little
trope.
oversaturation with those. I think the new Zombieland movie that's coming out is going to put kind of the end cap on the zombie thing. For the time being, they'll come back. They come around. But horror is the things that scare you. And so when you're thinking about horror, you want to think about the shadow. Imagine being a kid and thinking about the shadows on the wall, and what could those shadows be? What's the scratching sound in the closet?
Very Babadook-esque.
It's probably the cat who got locked in the closet. But what is that? And when you're a kid, what is that? And what you want to try and do is get that same response from the reader as an adult, as a teen, as whoever's picking it up.
For your audience.
And I think one of the best examples of horror done gently, you might say, is The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon by Stephen King. It is a very short read. You can probably sit down and read it in an afternoon or two. And it is a little girl gets lost in the woods. And take it from there. It is terrifying, and you get into her head, and it's great. So read that. You can also read Neil Gaiman's Coraline.
Yeah.
Which
terrifying.
It is. Here's the best thing about Coraline. I read about this book. I was living in Portland, Oregon at the time. I read a review of the book, and it was the shortest review of a book I've ever read, and it was also what made me get up off my butt at the coffee shop that I was at. Speaking of coffee shops, race down to Powell's City of Books, buy it, go back, and I sat down and I read that book cover to cover.
Oh my goodness.
And this is the review. I remember it verbatim.
So for all of you reviewers out there,
just remember. I remember this review for Coraline verbatim. A thrilling adventure ride for children that will leave adults having nightmares. And that is true. It is wonderful.
Okay. So I have one final, talking point. I need you to tell me about meeting Stephen King.
So, Stephen King...
My God. Stephen King, can you imagine?
Stephen King came into my life by way of Stanley Kubrick's atrocity of The Shining, and then reading his book. And what happened between being 8 years old and being 14, 15 years old going into ninth grade was that I was reading King voraciously. I was eating up the books as they came out. I was talking about them. I was toying with short stories.
He sort of lit that fire.
So he really lit that fire. And so between 8th and ninth grade, I made the decision on my own, not assigned, to read The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Mm-hmm. And some of you may have some sort of visceral response to that, but I tell you, I loved that book. It is one of my favorite books. It is beautiful and heartbreaking and wonderful. And unbeknownst to me, after I'd read this book, my mom wrote a letter to Stephen King essentially saying, "You got my kid to read a classic on his own. Thank you so much for all that you've done by telling these stories." Mm-hmm. And so I come home from school early in this, it's fall. It was probably within the first month or two of school. Mm-hmm. And there's a package on the doorstep addressed to me, and I open it up, and 2 books come out. One of them is Needful Things by Stephen King, which I don't think had been released officially yet at the time. I could be wrong. I'm very fuzzy. And the other one was Pearl by Tabitha King. And I opened these books, and both books are signed by the authors. Tabitha King is Stephen King's wife. And
I love when authors do that.
And so when I'm looking at the inscriptions from Stephen King, it says, "For Micah, with best wishes, and say hi to your mom for me." And I was like, what? So my mom gets home from work, and I'm like, why does Stephen King want me to say hi to you? Why does Stephen King want me to say hi to you? And so she tells me that she wrote this letter, and wow, so I still have those books. And then my senior year of high school, I'd written a short story. And I was like, all right, I'm going to send it to Stephen King. I'm putting I'm putting the short story in there, and I asked for a grant. Like a writing grant. Mm-hmm. And I asked for a letter of recommendation for college, and I sent it off to him. And I didn't get a grant, but I did get a letter back from him stating, the beautiful letter, and it stayed on my writing desk forever, and I still have it on my writing desk. It is now beaten up and torn up, and
you need to frame that sucker.
Well, I framed it, and then it,
my God, Stephen King wrote you a letter,
and then the frame fell and broke, and the broken glass like sliced up the old paper, and so it looks kind of like it's come out of a Stephen King book at this point, which is appropriate. But so I've kept that there, and I live in Maine, so he does readings all over the state, and so I bump into him and we say hi, and I've sent a couple of other letters in college back and forth for a while, and he's just so cool. A generally great human being.
That is so cool. So cool. I'm really jealous. Like, he has letters from Stephen King saying that he writes beautifully. Because I read this letter, okay? I read it, and Stephen King tells him that he writes beautifully. So, jealous. Anyway, so with the competition and everything wrapping up, I guess let's talk a little bit about that. Are you excited for the end of the week? Are you excited to pitch and do all the good stuff?
Yeah, I would actually say that I'd like to start tomorrow.
And who's your toughest competition?
Right there.
I totally am. I am.
Beautiful writer, beautiful prose.
Thank you. You're so sweet.
It'll end up somewhere, even if she doesn't win. It'll end up somewhere, and my girls will read these books.
I totally hope so, because I also have a strong, empowered female as a protagonist. So there's that girl power. So we're having to kind of wrap up. I know this is a little bit of a longer video. I also don't have my light with me, and there may be some ambient noise because there's a bunch of other people in this house, and it's like an 1800s renovated farmhouse out in Vermont. It's gorgeous out here. So I apologize if the video quality or the light quality is not as good. But I'm hoping to maybe do another couple of videos or video series with maybe some of the other contestants, an editor who is normally here on staff, and to do like a travel tips for writers thing, because I had a horrible travel experience, and I don't want you to be like me. Don't be like me.
Take your laptop. Make sure you have all your writing stuff.
This is a different video, okay? You're jumping the gun.
Use Scrivener.
Stop. Stop it. He's so mad because I uninstalled Scrivener from my computer and he felt personally offended by this.
Scrivener is the most brilliant writing tool imaginable.
I tried. It just doesn't work for me. Anyway, this has been super fun. I really hope that y'all enjoyed having Micah on and me kind of interviewing. I know I didn't do a lot of talking like I normally do. But I think that Micah is really cool, and the fact that he writes horror is really cool. And so let me know what you think in the comments down below. I'm going to link in the description, again, I mentioned this before, the short story anthology that he has on Amazon in case anybody is interested in reading that.
On Kindle.
On Kindle. And I'll also make sure that any of the books that Micah talked about in this video, that I have like a list of them in case you're interested in sort of like his reading list recommendation from the video as well. That way you're not having to go back and try and find the timestamps for each and every one. Also, if you want to connect with me or Micah on social media, you know where to go. Ring the bell, like, subscribe, do all the things. You know what to do. You're awesome. Join the family. That is all, basically.
Bye.
Bye.